Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, minister, and friend, Chino Ross, pastor and the voice of the Understanding Scripture and Truth by Chino D. Ross YouTube channel. Chino, it's good to be back, and I'm a little hesitant to get too deeply into this subject we're talking about today. We don't really plan these things ahead of time. We just get together and I say, hey, Chino, what are we going to talk about today? And it just kind of happens, casually we discuss it. But this particular subject we're talking about today, fortunately, I've not had too many people bring it up. And I do these, every Friday I do the interviews with people who have escaped and they tell their stories. And it really, fortunately for me, hasn't really got into this area. But the area we're getting into, I can't avoid it forever. We do need to discuss it. But when we get to talking about the gender roles and the family relationships, it's a very touchy subject, especially if you were in one of these movements. And so it's got to happen. I'm glad it's you that are bringing this up and not me.
Well, John, I'm not afraid of very many things, so I'm happy to discuss this issue of what we might entitle broadly male and female relationships. I don't even know how far we'll get. I have some things in mind to talk about today, and of course, I'm always happy to get your input and how and where this resonates with your background with William Branham. But, we've been looking at this long list of don'ts that just seemed as though it became longer by the month at the end of Hobart's life. I really am still trying to talk about the fall of 1984, everything that was leading up to Dr. Freeman's death, and just how dark everything had become at Faith Assembly. So we've looked here recently at him outlawing certain career paths, clubs, organizations, co-ops, board games, cards, dice. Just pretty much nursery rhymes, abbreviations. I think we talked about abbreviations. Abbreviations were not allowed. One of the things I said in that was he had a favorite abbreviation because of a certain charismatic heresy he was always attacking, and that was the JDS, the Jesus Died Spiritually heresy. So there is his book with the abbreviation JDS. And what's interesting, on the first page, the second paragraph, Hobart wrote, several years ago when this doctrine first began to be stressed by certain charismatic teachers, I designated this error for sake of brevity as the JDS doctrine. Therefore, it will be referred to as JDS in this book hereafter. And that's the whole purpose of abbreviations, is brevity. We don't want to always say the United States. We just want to say the U.S. So anyway, it's just he was reaching at Faith Assembly like a critical mass. They were going to implode. Something was going to happen, and that's exactly what did happen. But one of the big areas was this area of male and female relationships, and probably next to Dr. Freeman's views on what I ended up calling his views, his doctrine of divine death, because nobody ever really got healed there of anything seriously. His doctrine of divine death, which meant that people died all the time. Now, they talked about, well, you just got to wait for the manifestation of your healing. But manifestation was just code language for, hey, you better expect to be sick for a very long time. Next to that doctrine, this was the biggest mess of all, because it affected the family life, and that's the basic core unit. It affected husband and wife. It affected the parents and the children. It affected the children back to their parents. I think there were long-term psychological and relationship effects that came from this. So I guess I could start this area by saying that Hobart had a certain structure in his mind where the father or the husband is the head of the family. So he's way up here at the very top rung of the ladder. At the very bottom would be the child or the children. And just a step above the child is the wife or the mother. So the gap between the wife and the mother and the child was very small compared to the gap between the wife and the husband. The husband was high on a pedestal. The wife and children were down very low. And this wasn't peculiar to Faith Assembly. I think you see this in a lot of fundamentalist church backgrounds and Pentecostal church and holiness church backgrounds. And it is true that Paul did say in Ephesians 5 that the husband is the head of the home, but he said so much more than that. He did say that, the Apostle Paul, but he just said so much more than that. And it's the so much more than that that was not given the proper amount of space at Faith Assembly for sure, and probably among these other churches. Dr. Freeman actually had, John, these two foundational messages, tapes entitled The Restoration of the Biblical Roles of Husband and Wife. It was a part 1 and a part 2. Those were foundational for him and for his church. If you listen to those tapes carefully, they have some very odd things on them. One of the really odd things is when he starts talking about creation. And he did that because Paul in the New Testament they do found the male headship on the basis of creation, that Adam was created first, then Eve. The man was not deceived, Paul said, but the woman was deceived and was in the transgression. So there is a creation order, and Hobart went back to that. And as he would discuss the actual narrative of Genesis 1 and 2, which most of us understand to be like this, that God made the heaven and the earth and everything in it in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. I mean, we all learned that from Sunday school. If you carefully listen to these two tapes of Hobart, he said that Eve was created 2 or 3 days later. He wasn't for sure how much later after creation Eve was created. And his point was Adam had a whole lot of time to be lonely and to be thinking about things before Eve came on the scene. Well, of course, that is completely false. Everything was done in 6 days, and God rested the seventh. And so that is actually on those tapes. People probably find that hard to believe, but if they go listen to them, they'll hear that. Those were foundational messages, the restoration. He said God is restoring all of this teaching to the church, which has been lost. And one of these teachings is the man is the head of the home. And so he's got the father up here. Like I say, he's got the child down here, and he's got the mother somewhere near the bottom. And he just wanted to talk all the time about, do you have divine order or disorder in your home? It became the name of series of tapes. And I'm sure your audience who has a Faith Assembly background, those of them that have that, they're going to remember all about, oh no, not another message on divine order or disorder. So it starts way down here with the children. The children are always at the bottom, and there were always a lot of them. And that was because of another view that they had that we'll get to hopefully later on in this interview. But he had a favorite phrase with children, that children are to be seen and not heard. That children are to be seen and not heard. I don't know that people are as familiar with Hobart Freeman's background himself, if they knew that, because we're always curious, how does a guy end up in this position or with this doctrine later in his life? But Hobart was raised in a very poor Catholic neighborhood in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. He had siblings. He had 6 or 7 of them. They were all sisters. He didn't have a brother. He had polio as a young boy. He didn't grow up, as I have said before, hunting and fishing and kicking ball and playing sports and shooting hoops and running a trap line. He didn't grow up that way. He had a bunch of women around him. He had all sisters around him. He grew up very poor. When he met Ava June Freeman, his wife, he found he found a woman cut from that mold of the Depression era that would fit in perfectly as his wife, because as sweet and kind and loving and godly as June was as a Christian woman, and other people knew her far, far better than I did, and I would only have all of those good things to say about her, I will say this, that by her own testimony, she never objected to anything Hobart said. She never argued. She never disagreed. There is actually a message. It's a little hard to find, but it's out there on YouTube because I've heard it. It is June's testimony done on May the 27th of 1977. If people will spend the time, they can find that, track it down, and I've heard it several times. The recording quality of that is not the best because it is done at a ladies' luncheon, so it sounds like it's in a cafeteria, and there's just echoing and there's a lot of background noise. But June gives her testimony, May the 27th, 1977, telling how she met Hobart. It's absolutely fascinating. And it's revealing, John, in this regard, because you get to hear the dynamics in the relationship from June's point of view. And June actually has these things to say. She says, and the reason I point this out is June was the matriarch of Faith Assembly. She was a lovely, godly, spiritual, kind, always smiling, always a helpful word kind of woman. So consequently, all of the other young women and mothers in the church looked up to her and they wanted to emulate her. And some of that is good. Some of that was terrible, because what they learned from June, as if you'll hear on that tape, if you listen to June's testimony, she said, she worshiped the ground Hobart walked on. She said, I would never disagree with my husband. I would never argue with my husband. She even tells the stories of how, it's kind of normal in American society for when it's time to run out the door and go somewhere to an appointment. Who are we men always waiting on? We're waiting on our wives because they're not quite ready yet. So she tells that, but she turns it around and she said, I would never keep my husband waiting. I am always ready first, and I'm just sitting there waiting for him to get ready. And so, that is not normal, I don't think, by anybody's standard, but it fit perfectly with Hobart's personality. One time, June delivered some speeches or messages from the pulpit on a Friday night at the Glory Barn. Hobart later came to say women couldn't speak in front in public in a mixed group, but there are actually tapes out there where June did that very thing. And on one of these occasions, when it was June's turn to speak that night, this is a very interesting story, because when Hobart was going to speak, she had his clothes laid out, everything, and she didn't want any obstacle, which is wonderful to do that as a wife. I'm not criticizing that. She didn't want any obstacle in Hobart's way to get ready to deliver the message that night. Well, this time it was her turn to deliver a message. She's still trying to get dinner on the table for both of them. She says he's trying to finagle that wires to his antenna for his ham radio out in the yard, and he calls me out there to help him with that. Of course, she just drops everything and runs out there instead of saying, I'm sorry, that'll have to wait for another day. I've got to get dinner done, and then I've got to go speak to Faith Assembly at the Glory Barn tonight. No, as the perfect Proverbs 31 virtuous woman, she lays herself down like a doormat, for Hobart to walk on. And I'm not saying that June did it knowingly, and I'm not saying that Hobart walked on her knowingly. I'm just saying that those are the facts in the relationship. You can hear them on the tape. And all that does is feed into this dominant male abusive role model that Hobart is projecting and setting up. So going back to the child is someone to be seen and not heard. He always was preaching against the child-centered home. That would be, if your child is crying, expressing a need, you've got to muffle that somehow, because that is not healthy. That is the child-centered home. And if you were to ask, how early should that start? That is going to start early. Let me just give you one quotation, and I'll take a breath, John, and you can give me your feedback. But he did a series on the book of Colossians. The last message, which actually was long, so it became 2 messages, was entitled Signs of True Believers, in parentheses, overcomers, because that's what a true believer was. This was taught in late 1979. So they're in the new building. They've been in the new building for about a year. As a matter of fact, on this tape is where he mentions, hey, did everyone notice that we have new ceiling panels up for the drop ceiling? Prior to that, they had all the lights and all the wires run, which were all exposed. But this was the time when they finally got some ceiling panels up. And he's talking on this because he's in Colossians. He's talking about family dynamics and family roles. And he's talking about parents being responsible for training and teaching their kids. At the 51-minute, 40-second mark, he said, and I quote, "Begin early, train them early. Is 6 months too early? No, it's too late. You wait 6 months, you're going to have a lot of housebreaking to do." So you tell me, what kind of child rearing is going to start at the age of 6 months?
You know, the whole family dynamics in Hobart Freeman's movement, Branhamism, everything that sprung from it is entirely flipped upside down. And what you've described, ironically, it was Branhamism 101. Children should be seen and not heard. I clearly remember being in somebody's house, and that was in one of those little things, those cross-stitching plaques that you put up by the door. I think somebody put that up. But that was a common phrase, and, you know, the woman is the man is the head of the house, and the women are subordinate. All of that is Branhamism 101. And the irony is, if we were to have probably a Freemanite, probably a Branhamite, anybody on the show, and we were to try to talk how wrong that is, they would defend it and say that's biblical. That's the irony of this. But if we were to have a Christian who was raised in a Christian home, who's never heard any of this, who has at least read their Bible, they would say that, even historically speaking, the early Christians, and even to a large extent the Jews before Christianity, were very far advanced in the equality towards women as compared to the rest of the world. And that's
right.
You can read documents on this. It's a quite interesting study. Then you get into the New Testament, and you read some of the passages in the New Testament. When you compare it to today's world, you think it's not. But if you understand the cultures back then, and understand that most women, if they did not have a man to help support them in that era, many of them would have just suffered and died, struggled to live because they could not provide for themselves in that culture. So some of the passages that sound like the women are subordinate are actually just, you know, help women, help support the women. And we've had the conversation a few times now, and I've had it with a few people now. When we read the letters that Paul wrote to the churches, we're reading someone else's mail. And you have to understand the context of how it's written, who it's written to, the time it's written. The passage talking about the hierarchy that Hobart was mentioning, straight out of Branhamism, obviously came from 1 Corinthians 11, talking about, you know, Christ is the head, the man is the head of the household, etc. But if you understand the full context of that passage, he's writing it to a group of people in Corinthians who came out of the cults of Dionysus. And in the cults of Dionysus, they had women that were these prophetesses that would had their hair was up in a bobby pin, and they'd pull the pin out, and they would go prophesy and rip the flesh off of animals. I think you and I talked about this once before. Well, there must have been a situation, we don't know all the details, but there must have been a situation where this was problematic, and Paul was addressing the church and the problems in the church. And then if you read down to I think it's verse 16. He says, "But we have no such custom, neither do the churches of God." So he just disqualified that entire section of text from from probably part of the chapter before to here, saying, I'm writing this to this church in Corinthians where there is a problem and there's a situation happening, but we as Christians don't have the custom that this entire thing revolves around. And the Pentecostals use that specific passage for the long hair doctrines, etc., ignoring the rest of the Bible. There are passages in the Bible where women are instructed to shave their heads for mourning, for example. So unless you understand the context, it turns into a different book. It's not the same Bible. Further amplify that by, in latter rain, Branhamism from early on, I want to say it was early as about the 50s, Branham introduced the notion that he had had a series of 7 prophecies way back in 1933. There's no evidence to support this before 1950s. And he says, women will destroy the United States. The women are going to vote. They're going to elect a female president. The female will cause the destruction of the United States and eventually the world. And so he's tainted the whole movement against women, right? Now, further that, you're being raised in a doomsday cult, and the way that the doctrine was presented, we're going to leave this earth very quickly, we're going to receive our new bodies, and how will this work, Brother Branham? Well, what's going to happen is you're going to receive a new body that's 20 years old. Does everybody receive a body that's 20 years old? What about my children who were just born? Of course, everybody gets a body that's 20 years old. So the parents are literally being taught that any day, could be tomorrow, you're going to step onto the other side, and these kids that you know right now are not even going to be anything like you know them. Suddenly, they're going to go from age 6 months to 20 years old. And what happens psychologically, the parents are disconnecting from their kids because this isn't somebody I'm going to know even tomorrow. And so the whole family dynamic in these groups just gets totally unraveled. And the hierarchy that's created, it ignores passages. Paul says I can't remember exactly how he says it. You probably know, but he says there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile. We're all one. We're all equal is what he's saying.
3:28. Yes.
Exactly. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
I think I might have even mentioned in our last interview, I talked to so many people, John, I can't remember, but I think it was you and I talking, because it's normally, it's about Hobart Freeman stuff, where Hobart said that, and he said it repeatedly, that most of the problems he ever had as a pastor of a church came from women. Almost all the problems came from women. And that's just not true at all. The problems came from his underlings, the ministers under him. They're the ones who caused all the problems. So it just shows a very low view of women. And that's what I was trying to document earlier with even June's statements herself. Hobart expected everything to be laid out in order for him. And that's just not that, regardless of your view of 1 Corinthians 11 or Ephesians 5 or Colossians 4, to say the husband is the head of the home, which the Bible does say, regardless of your view on that, and it is a difficult area to discuss, but regardless of your view, there is so much more that is said in the Bible that was definitely not given equal time. And I've seen in the comments on some of our podcasts so far, John, just the women crying out that, we were the silent majority. We were definitely the beaten down part of Faith Assembly and its outreach, both the women and the children. And speaking of beaten down, it brings us to another topic, and that is Proverbs 13:24. If you spare the rod, you spoil the child. And this just became a huge issue at Faith Assembly. And again, and I think I've said this before, these cults and these people like Dr. Freeman who ended up with some false views and in other areas, false emphases, balance that was out of balance, out of harmony. They're all basing it on a scripture somewhere. And so Proverbs 13:24 is in the Bible. But for Dr. Freeman to spend the time that he did on it, I always felt that he was just way out of his element. We need to remind ourselves he was trained in Old Testament and Hebrew, the biblical language of Hebrew. That was his professional training. He was not trained in child and adolescent development. He was not trained in child and adolescent psychology. He was not trained as a sex counselor. He was not a marriage therapist. He was not a family therapist. Those are difficult areas and topics that require professional training and education in. And he simply did not have that. I think his life, if you want to study it carefully, would show more, and I hate to say it, but I think it's true, would show more of an absentee father. Kathy, his middle girl, got involved with Bruce Kinsey, probably with Hobart, not even knowing it. I know whenever Kathy married Bruce, June found out from a friend at the grocery store. They didn't even know they were married. And I will say this as a little tease, and we'll save this for the future, but I do have a deathbed confession that Hobart Freeman made that is very, very interesting. So we will save that for whenever we get to his sickness, his death, the autopsy, Dr. Patricia Newhouse, who was a pathologist who did the autopsy. We will save that for that time period. But the deathbed confession, when I heard it, because there were a large number of people that had been called over to the house to pray for him before he died, and maybe pray for him to come back to life after he died. That was just a fiasco in itself. But when I heard, because I wasn't there, obviously, when I heard the deathbed confession, all it did to me, John, is that I knew it. I didn't have to hear that. I know if you, Hobart's got 1,157 tapes on his tape list. I've heard them all more than once. I'm pretty familiar with the way the man thought back then. And being familiar with that, I could anticipate. I just know what it's like. That Hobart, he was not a pastor. He did not have a shepherd's heart. A shepherd's heart is kind and patient and loving. And you're actually going and seeking out the lost sheep. He was running people out the door if they disagreed with him. I mentioned before, and I even have an update on this, whenever Brother Gary Hall, the first one who was tried, convicted, sentenced, and spent time in jail, in prison, Gary Hall, for the death of his child. I said, when you and I did this, without any way to prove my point, I said, I would bet that Hobart Freeman, as the pastor, never visited that man. And I said, if anybody has a way to prove otherwise, then I will retract that. I actually have people who said we in our family visited Gary regularly in prison. And no, Hobart never visited him, not to their knowledge. Gary never said, and he never said Hobart visited me. I was this close a couple of weeks ago, that close to getting to talk to Gary. We have a mutual friend, and Gary wanted to talk to me. I actually traded texts with him because, he spent time. I mean, this is where the rubber meets the road. He went to jail for Dr. Freeman's view. And Gary said, yeah, I'll be willing to talk to you, Chino. And then last minute, he bailed on me, didn't want to talk to me. And I said, I totally understand, brother. No pressure from my end. If you ever change your mind, I'm always available. And I hope Gary listens to these podcasts. I think maybe he is. And And his statement was that he didn't see himself a victim. And I appreciate what I think Gary's trying to say by that. But what I would say to Gary and to everyone is a victim of Dr. Freeman. Everybody was a victim of his teaching. I think what Gary was trying to say, and I could be wrong, I could have misinterpreted, but I think he's just trying to be an adult, like some people, and said, hey, nobody forced me with a gun to the side of my head to follow Hobart Freeman. I was an adult. I made the decision myself. I suffered the consequences of that. And I would respond to that. There is an element of truth to that. We were all adults. We all chose to do what we did. However, even though it wasn't a gun to the side of our head, it was psychological, verbal manipulation, and you most definitely were a victim. So I understand someone not wanting to appear to be a baby, like, oh, poor me, I didn't want to follow the guy, but somebody made me follow him. I understand that point of view of saying, I was an adult and, I had to make, this is a decision I made, and whatever the consequences are, I have to live with that. But I would say that we were all a victim. Anyway, back to Proverbs 13:24. This corporal punishment just came by the boatload, and it was all out of perspective and out of balance, and it became the only acceptable form of child discipline. And it's not that Proverbs 13:24 presents a problem. What presents a problem is the lack of any normal, reasonable approach to child rearing. Hobart was a man of laws and legalisms. And if he could find a verse that would say something, husband's head of the family, spare the rod, spoil the child. I've got 2 verses, so we're just going to roll with it like that. But there is so much more that needed to be said. And you've got to remember, this is also the same man who had taken everything away from children. You can't play games. You can't go to school. No toys. No holidays. No social activities. No neighborhood friends. No bonfires. No nursery rhymes as you go to sleep at night. I mean, he had already taken all of these things away from kids. And now you've got the parents, normally the fathers, wailing away on their butts. No wonder we have this Facebook group called the Children of FA with a lot of people who are pretty upset, pretty burned, and pretty bitter about the whole situation. And you throw into this mix, John, of all of this corporal punishment instead of these children. And let me just say this, I'm not talking about every family, because I've had women reach out to me and say, we did not. My husband and I wail away on our children. We had good times with our kids. We raised them in a loving environment. And I definitely believe that's true of many families. I'm just saying that there were too many of the other variety. And it's probably, it's traceable back to Dr. Freeman. It's some of the things he was dealing with in his own life. I know he did not have a close relationship with his father. He mentions him one time on 1,157 messages, one time that I can remember on 1,157 messages. He only mentions his mother a couple of times, and that is when he claimed John 14:14 and claimed his mother's salvation. So that's really just to tell a story about how he exercised faith and saw his mom saved. The only story I remember about his dad is when Hobart got saved down in St. Pete on the road home from that nightclub in Tampa, got back to his place where they live, opened up his store on Sunday morning. The man came in looking for a donation to the church, and Hobart said, times are bad. I don't have anything I can give you. And the man said, you need to go home and read Malachi 3. Will a man rob God? Well, Hobart tells the story. He said, I went home and I had to dig around and look for the Bible that my father gave me. That's the only time I ever even heard him mention his dad, is in connection to his father having given him a Bible whenever he was a young child. So we have these children, and we have them, John, in the context, something else that I need to tie into this, of very young fathers. The following of the Glory Barn in the early years was primarily late teens and early 20s with a few older people sprinkled in the mix. So you've got a young population. They are easily manipulated and persuaded by Dr. Freeman. Their very age, and they get married, their very age tells us, like I was at that age, you have no experience in child rearing. And so what you're witnessing as a model is male abuse by the pastor. I mean, that is the leader that your attention is focused on. This man knows everything and can do no wrong. And so you as a young, I'm trying to think back and put myself in the position of these young fathers at the time. This is a type of leadership. This guy who's always boasting and bragging about himself and threatening everybody else. You see, well, this is the way you control the situation. This is the way you control people around you. You do it by arrogance and you do it by intimidation. And Hobart did it by excommunication. So these guys could do it by, some extreme corporal punishment. And we also have to figure into the dynamic that because of the path that Faith Assembly was taking, there was a lot of alienation that happened between these young couples and their parents and their in-laws. So where you would normally have parents and in-laws, when you had questions like, Mom, I've got a 11-month-old crying. What am I supposed to do about it? Rather than having that good positive influence from your elders, you've already been isolated from them. That's what cults do. They divide and conquer. They make sure all abuse situations, they isolate you from your support network, from your support group around you. So these young fathers and mothers were cut off from parents. They were cut off from in-laws. They were cut off from the good advice that those people could give. And because of the teaching that the women were hearing, that the man's the head of the home, they're afraid to go against their husbands. It was just a terrible scenario set up, the way Hobart had done all this, and this overemphasis on male leadership and male headship. Now, if the women are seeing something happen with the husbands spanking the children too much, remember the quote I gave from Colossians, if you wait until they're 6 months old, it's too late. Said, how soon should you start training them? 6 months? Is that too early? Hobart said, no, that's too late. And if you wait till 6 months, what in the world are you going to train a child at the age of 6 months? I think what we have on our hands is that as soon as a little infant cried, and infants cry because they're hungry or because they're dirty or they're wet or they're uncomfortable or they're tired. They have a reason. They're not crying because they're a mean, hateful, disobedient human being. They're crying because they have a need, and that's the only way they know how to express it. And so what's going to happen to them? They're going to get taken out in the back, and they're going to get the daylights wailed out of them, and that's exactly what happened.
One of the real problems with all of this, if you go to a normal, healthy church where they're talking about normal, healthy Christian things, they're not in your business. They're not in the things that really have no business being said behind the pulpit anyway. But when you're in these cults, they want to be up in your business and they want to control every aspect of your life. Like you said, they've had you cut off people who aren't in the cult. So you're all of the people who should be in your business, the people who you should connect with and learn how to survive in this world that we live in things that aren't church related. They've been cut off, and all you get is somebody who it sounds like Hobart Freeman was very much like Branham in the later years. They're just bitter and angry at the world. And so you see all these rants and these insults, and Branham would talk about often if his daughters were to dress what he considered to be inappropriately, he'd be so angry he'd take a barrel slat, which you've seen these, right? It's a great big old board, and he'd tan her hide. And he says some of those old mothers in Kentucky used to beat the naked flesh of their children until they were so mutilated they couldn't get the clothes back on. That's what we need to do today. That's an actual quote from Branham. So wow. They're training people to be not just physically abusive, but assault their children. And I went back, whenever I found that quote, I was doing a study on the corporal punishment, and I found that quote, and I was shocked, man, because that's awful. I go back and I listen to it. The people who hear that quote are so under the mind control that you can hear brothers standing up and saying, "Amen, brother," and all of this, like everybody is unanimously agreeing that we should mutilate the flesh of our children. That's how bad this is. And it's because he's angry, he's lost his mind, he's off the rails. Everybody in it's under this weird mind control who they think that this is God speaking directly to them to tell them to physically assault their children. And none of it should be even remotely connected to the church. If you want to learn how to instruct your children, it's not something that you're going to hear from a pastor. You need to get, like you said, with your parents or your friends, people who outside of a church can help you to grow in ways that aren't church related.
Yeah, I totally agree, John. And like I said earlier, Hobart he didn't have the professional training in this whole area of child and adolescent psychology. My undergraduate degree happens to be in secondary education, so I'm no expert in the area of child or adolescent psychology, but I remember that was a part of our core curriculum because as a teacher, you're going to be around children, and there are complex theories, and there's a lot of data, there's a lot of information that you study in child development, child rearing, and child and adolescent psychology. And that's not something that was Hobart's field of expertise. For some reason, though, anything Hobart talked about, he thought he was an expert on it. And this is off the subject, but I've had other people even tell me that when Hobart would get into the area of maybe talking about farming or feed for cattle because he thought he could throw something out there, the people that do that for a living would just laugh like, he didn't even use the terminology the way you're supposed to use it. You know, I always say you can never beat a man at his own job. If that's what he does for a living, I don't care if it's feeding cattle or hanging drywall. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's got all the tools, he's got all the experience, and he knows all the terminology. Hobart did like to dabble in electronics and amateur radio, but I had someone one time tell me who is a professional electrician. He said Hobart didn't know what he was talking about. He just threw some stuff out there to make himself sound impressive because he did like to tinker and build little transistor things. This guy said that stuff's easy to do. You know, we work on these 1,000,000-volt power lines that go over the city. You know, you want to talk about electricity, that's electricity right there. And when I heard him say that, then, you know, my mind is always thinking, I'm a curious person. Then I could go back and reflect and think of some other areas where Hobart had thrown out some comments. And I thought, yeah, I think it's kind of like name dropping. You know, name dropping is you mention the names of a couple of famous people to make it appear like you're friends with them and you're in their circles. That's what name dropping is. I think he did the same thing with all kinds of topics. He would drop a phrase or two and you go, oh, wow, you know, he knows a lot about that subject. He didn't know diddly squat about that. I think that was just his way to make himself feel better, bigger, smarter, more important, more in control. And it was his way to control, you know, because the people out there go, my word, this guy talks about everything from Greek to Hebrew to electronics to child rearing. You know, he is a Dr. Phil behind the pulpit. He knows, you know, everything out there. And I'll give you a good example that I have often thought of when it comes to this area of name dropping something like that, because I taught a series of over 200 messages on biblical and extra biblical literature. I came to know a whole lot about the manuscripts and the whole subject of textual criticism. And so what was so funny with Dr. Freeman is he used the King James Bible, which I use, which is fine. It's based on a certain textual tradition, and it's the Byzantine text. And that's a complicated stuff. You have to know what's going on there, or you don't know. Hobart would come to, here's what he would do. He would come to a verse or two in the King James, which the King James was following the so-called TR, the Textus Receptus, which is the Byzantine family of textual transmission. And he would say, now, this verse was not in the original manuscripts. We need to correct it. And then he would correct it. And what he would do was follow what we call the Westcott and Hort textual transmission. And this is the Greek text that you will see in Nestle Aland and the United Bible Society's 26th edition. And he would correct it. But then on another tape, he would wail against that liberal Westcott and Hort theory. So he didn't even realize the mistake he was making. He was correcting the King James as he should have done. He was following Westcott and Hort textual view. And then later he would criticize them because he didn't even know that when he made the corrections in the KJV, he was following Westcott and Hort. That's neither here nor there. That may be over everybody's head. But because I knew the background of textual transmission, I knew you don't have a clue what you're talking about. You've read something in a blurb on the back of a book and you're throwing that out there to act important, but you can't connect the dots and you can't put everything together. Somebody told me here recently who used to be a part of Jeff Barnett's church down in Acton. Jeff Barnett had a well-known song leader. I won't use his name, but I have spoken with several of his children, and several of his other children have written on the Children of Faith Assembly Facebook group, not very happy with their upbringing. I have a friend who happened to live in the same area as the song leader at Jeff Barnett's church in Acton. And he would occasionally, coming to and from church, see the song leader who had a station wagon with his kids. He said, I'll never forget, Chino. I remember leaving church one day. The song leader was ahead of me down the highway. And we went the same way because I had to go home to my home. He was going home to his home. And here I'm coming down the highway and I see the song leader and his station wagon pulled over there. And he's got one of those boys out just wailing him from here to Amarillo. And he said, I just drove right on by, but I knew that's brother so-and-so wailing away on one of his kids. So, yeah, it was a very problematic issue at Faith Assembly. And I just hate to hear the stories and just the negative aftermath that will have probably, it's affected people. John, it not only affected the ones who were disciplined, but then they were taught that's the way you discipline. So it's like this whole abuse cycle. Somebody in the family, has to break the cycle. And I hope a lot of these families have, and they realize that I'm not saying you can't spank your child, but the way it was taught at Faith Assembly was just way out of proportion and way out of balance, and was not a loving way at all.
The other problem is when you're in a group like this where the leader, the central figure, is in your business and he's angry and he's teaching you how to treat other people in an angry way, whenever there are people who are in his congregation that have slight mental health issues or just anger issues in general, the problem is it further amplifies it. People who ordinarily would not be violent and would not create problems in their families, now they're under this system where they're being told this is a good thing. Encourage the anger, encourage the punishment, encourage the physical violence. There is a website. I worked with several people who had escaped Branhamism and now other cults as well. Many of the women are severely mistreated under this type of leadership because they may have been in a marriage where a husband had some sort of psychological issue and it was further amplified by this. And so there are some awful stories. If your listeners want to hear it, it's castingpearlsproject.com. A lady has started a place where women can share their voices and talk about what happened. But it's a huge problem for not just the women, because while the women suffered in many ways the wrath of the man, from a psychological standpoint, what it's doing to the men's heads in these movements is the equivalent to what's being manifested physically with their wives, or verbally with their wives. So it's all around. It's a horrific thing that's happening.
That's just an excellent point, John, that I did not mention earlier. But yes, I think that for some of these young men, they probably had a pretty balanced idea and view, maybe based on the way they were raised, on how to raise their kids. And they probably did a pretty good job. But to your point, some of the ones that came from a dysfunctional family, and from what I have been told, that the song leader of Jeff's church came from his own dysfunctional family. And so this is just perpetuated. And so for some of these men, this type of model, Hobart Freeman, that they are following, just brought out the worst of them, and they revert back to their Cro-Magnon Neanderthal days. And so, yeah, it was a bad situation. So let's maybe, if we've got time, John, let's talk about one other thing. I'm just going to mention it. I'm going to see if you even know where in the world I'm going. Okay, so little boys and little girls were not allowed to play together. Why do you think that might be the case, John?
I don't know if I want to touch this one, but I know exactly where you're headed with it.
You know, I'm trying to work my way chronologically from birth. We're going to get to that whole dating realm here, but I'm still with I'm talking about, I'm with 5 and 6 and 7 and 8-year-old children on this point. Little boys and little girls were not allowed to play together. According to one of the ministers, this was the phrase. And I'm telling you, I mean, you just don't know what to do with these groups. You know, it's like they're out in the twilight zone, but they were not allowed to play together because they might rub up against each other. Oh my goodness. We're talking about innocent babies, 5 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old. We're not talking about 14 and 15-year-olds. We'll get to them in a minute. You have to watch out for them because the hormones are raging by that time. And did that become a whole disaster in itself? I'm back to pre-adolescent times, that the little children were separated based on gender because they might rub up against one another. You know, and that's just gross. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it, but what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? I mean, really, what is wrong with you as a minister to ever stand up and say anything like that in a mixed congregation? What is wrong with you to make a statement like that? And Hobart, by the way, he was not the one who said this. It was someone else. But one grown woman now, who was very young back in those days, just told me this story. She said there was a particular minister. I'm not going to mention any names because I don't want to. Well, I'm just not going to mention any names. But she said this minister just kept you in his message. And I think this girl might have been a preteen or a young teen, just kept using the word lust, L-U-S-T, lust, just lust, and lust is bad, and don't lust. And if you rub up against somebody, you might lust, and don't lust. And she said, Chino, I decided, I pulled out my notepad and I wanted to count how many times was he using the word lust in this message. This is an old minister and a young lady. And she said she had a friend beside her that was curious and wanted to look over and see, well, what are you jotting down there? She said, I had to quickly close my book because I didn't want her to see what she was documenting, coming up with a tally of the number of times this old dude was talking about lust. And I'll tell you, when I heard that story, it reminded me of, what it really reminded me of, John, is way back in the days. I don't know if you remember, you probably do, but Jimmy Swaggart, who was a big Pentecostal preacher down in Louisiana. And I remember Jimmy Swaggart used to just rail against sexual sin and all that's immorality and all of you evil people out there, and warning his church, warning his men against lust and warning them against sin and warning them against doing anything outside their, I mean, he would rail on it and thump with his Bible. Well, we know who got caught with prostitutes in motel rooms. It was Jimmy Swaggart, right? And I think that there's a phrase for it, and it's called psychological projection. I think the person who rails against homosexuality in all of his messages, he might be a closet. I mean, he might be, because why do you need to talk about that all the time? There's no need to. I mean, you mention it, but and because you don't have a fascination with it, you just go on. You say homosexuality is wrong, in your message, and you just go on because you have no fascination with it. But if you do have a fascination with it, then maybe you rail on it too much. Maybe that's what you talk about all the time. It's called psychological projection. I think that's what Jimmy Swaggart was doing. I think that's what other ministers have done. And it may have been what some of these ministers were doing. They're projecting the problem of lust that they are experiencing. And I don't mean that they're lustful toward little children. I don't know them, so I don't know what they were lustful toward. But they're projecting a problem that they're dealing with themselves. It's a very well-known occurrence among speakers to psychologically project whatever it is you are dealing with most intimately yourself. You project that on your audience as though all of you are the ones doing it. I'm not. I'm clean. But I want to warn you against this sin. And so, we've got this situation which should never have been brought up in a church. You should not be talking about little boys and little girls. You just don't do that in church. This is church of all places. Where are people's manners and where are their upbringings to talk about? Now, let's keep our boys and girls separated after the service is over when they go outside and play, because we don't want any little boys and girls to rub up against each other. It's just pitiful, and it's part of the sad legacy of some of the ministers of Faith Assembly.
Yeah, I've studied that as well. There are a significant number of problems with the ministers who are talking about a specific sin and concentrating it every single Sunday, concentrating on it. And it's confusing to the people for the most part because, well, he said that last Sunday. Why is he bringing it up again? And in many cases, I'm laughing. It's not funny, but I'm laughing about the little small children getting together, boys and girls. Well, nobody in the church had to have seen that as a problem except for the guy who's crazy and who must have an issue with it, right? So they're all probably thinking, why is he talking about that? That's just really weird. But anyway, I studied it to some extent because Branham railed in many different ways about women in ways that just aren't natural, aren't normal. One of the things that came out of the Latter Rain movement is that women are a byproduct of men. They weren't created in the original creation; they were an afterthought. And the way that they made this weird leap is that because the woman was pulled from the rib in the book of Genesis, she wasn't in the original creation; she was in the rib. But if you turn the page, it says male and female created he them, right? But the Bible was second place to the doctrine in these movements. They really didn't care what the Bible said as long as they could fit the agenda. And the agenda in many cases was to discriminate against the women. And the problem, like I've been alluding to all along, is it conditions the listeners to think it's okay to have this type of discrimination. And further, the men who are doing this usually do it in a joking way or in a vindictive way that makes the people think it's okay to be insulting while you do it as well. So you've got the insult, the injury, the whole array of problems. I grew up in that environment, and I watched men and women struggle because the man's not treating the woman correctly, and the woman can't stand up for herself in the movement. And then I've watched people escape, and I've watched them just blossom. Suddenly they go into a church where they realize, wait a minute, that's unhealthy. That's not how it's supposed to be. And I watch their whole families just flourish because of it.
Yeah. I don't know your marriage, John, but I would assume it's similar to mine. I'm married to a wonderful, my wife's a little tiny thing. She's 5'2", 120 pounds. She's kind and sweet and generous and probably views me as the head of the household. But I'll tell you, she got another thing in her called independence. And if I was to dare treat her, in a way that is condescending or just in an inappropriate way, I would hear about that immediately, and rightfully so. And I have heard about it immediately in the past. And that's, you can't have a leader in a church or a leader in a home who can just get away with being how they want to be. You want to be a slob? You want to be an idiot? Go right ahead. No. That's part of the check and balance. If you have a good wife, and my wife has told me before, what you said, I need to hear an apology forthcoming immediately. And I do not tolerate that kind of behavior. And the women at Faith Assembly could never have said anything like that to their husband, but that's perfectly allowed by Scripture and perfectly allowed by God. And it is healthy for the man and for the marriage, for the woman to be able to put her foot down and say, that simply is not acceptable in this home. As long as I'm the wife and the mother here, that won't be happening in my home. That's totally acceptable. But could that have been said by those women? Absolutely not. And I'm just sad and sorry to have to say that.
Yes, about my wife. Well, when I was in the cult, I used to carry a nice big stick, and now I just hand it over to her and say, here, it's yours. No.
Good decision, brother. Good decision.
No, we're, like everything else, everything is new for us. We had to learn how to live life after leaving. And I think that's the case with a lot of people who are in these things, because you weren't really trained properly in how to live life. And the things that they taught you, they had no business teaching you in the first place, is the problem. And
right.
The second problem is the person teaching you is pretty well crazy. But I'm glad we're out of it. I'm glad we got through this. This wasn't as touchy as I thought. I think where you're heading with it is probably going to be the touchier subject. So we'll save that for next time. But this was fun. I'm glad we did it. If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and soon Audible.